Tonight, Revolution 2011, the unrest sweeping the Middle East and North Africa, which has changed our world and affects every one of us. With Mubarak gone, Ben Ali gone, Gaddafi teetering and resorting to repression, how far will these unfinished revolutions produce what many on the streets want, a new democracy? Why has the choice in Arab countries for decades always been between a strongman or Islamism? Is there now a third way? We'll be charting the extraordinary story of the past 2 months, from its beginnings in Tunisia to today's mayhem in a divided Libya. We'll speak to key people throughout the region, including a leading Israeli and a leading Jordanian politician. Also to discuss what next and how the West should respond, we'll hear from one of those who helped topple Hosni Mubarak in Cairo and from a former top British diplomat. Paul Mason will bring us his take on how modern Arab culture has changed to help produce this new revolutionary wave. And we'll explore the consequences with historians and writers, including Francis Fukuyama, Simon Schama and Hisham Matar. Hello, good evening. The revolutions of 2011 are incomplete, but already they have changed the entire world. The new democratic impulse unleashed in Arab states has shown that supposed strongmen can be overthrown by popular insurrection. And from the surge in oil prices to the pent-up demands for political change, they affect all of us. In this special edition of Newsnight, we're going to examine what the next steps are likely to be, what Arab democracies might look like, whether we might see new Islamic republics, and how a new generation of educated young Arabs, armed with the internet and Twitter, have unnerved every one of the undemocratic rulers who've held power in their region for decades. We'll hear from John Simpson live inside Libya in a few moments. First, Alan Little sets the scene for us with his analysis of Revolution 2011, a work in progress.
It began with a moment of terrible desperation in the remote and unremarkable town of Sidi Bouzid. Driven mad by the corruption and brutality of local officials, a 26-year-old fruit seller doused himself in petrol and set fire to himself. Who would have thought one family's sorrow could be so subversive? Mohamed Bouazizi almost overnight became a symbol of resistance. His defiance inspired others. Suddenly, Tunisia was in revolt. Rattled, the president, Zini al-Abidine Ben Ali, went to his bedside. But it was too late. For all his might, Ben Ali was no match for the symbolic power the dying young man now commanded. 10 days after his funeral, Ben Ali fled the country, the first Arab dictator to be toppled by a popular uprising.
It's unprecedented that a leader gets toppled in that way, that people go out in the streets and they topple the president. This wasn't the army, this was the people of Tunisia that had toppled this president, who came out and made 3 speeches, and each one he looked even more scared than the one before, and he just disappeared. In that sense, I think what we saw was elsewhere in the region rumblings of, oh well, this could happen here as well.
The shock of it convulsed the region. In Algeria, rising food prices had already triggered protests. The Arab world had for years been sitting on a demographic time bomb. Too many young people, too few jobs. Tunisia had shown that protest need not be futile. It emboldened the poor across the region. Especially in Egypt. Protesters were now talking to each other on social networking websites. They harnessed the democratizing power of the internet. On January the 25th, thousands took to the streets. Suddenly, there was a confident new Arab voice crying out for citizenship and human rights. As Hosni Mubarak, in power for 29 years, tried to cling to office, Cairo's Tahrir Square became a place of symbolic resistance. Egyptians had crossed a vital threshold. They broke through the fear barrier, defying the state brutality that had until now cowed them.
We don't afraid from anybody here in Egypt. We are Egyptian people here. We will say our word.
Pro-government gangs also marched on the square. For a couple of days, there were violent clashes. This was an opportunity for the army to intervene, using the violence as a pretext to clear the streets. Crucially, they did not. Instead, military chiefs said they would not use force. The people, they said, had a legitimate right to be heard. By early February, only one thing would satisfy the protesters: the removal of Mubarak himself. Only days earlier, it had seemed an impossible dream. On February the 11th, it happened. Mubarak went.
I just hope it's a civil state. It becomes a civil state and the army takes this to democracy. Egypt is a free country. We will never be beaten by anyone.
But when the security forces feel that they've lost legitimacy and are losing status with the people, then the ruler realizes that the skids are under him. And the change in Egypt came because the security chiefs said to Mubarak, "You're in a cul-de-sac, you can't survive. Maybe we haven't told you the truth up to now, but you've now got to go."
The security forces would also play a crucial role in the tiny island kingdom of Bahrain. Here, inspired by the Egyptians, protesters made Pearl Square their own symbolic place of resistance. Riot police moved against them as they slept. 3 died and hundreds were wounded. But Bahrainis too had breached the fear barrier. The protests went on despite the guns. The government quickly backed down. On Saturday the 19th, the army and police quietly withdrew. The protesters took back the square to demand an end to the autocratic rule of the royal family.
We are living here and we will die here also. Whatever, we are not afraid and will not care. Down, down, Hamad! Down, down, Hamad! Down, down.
In Libya, protests began in mid-February and descended quickly into chaos and brutality. Security forces, many of them foreign mercenaries loyal to Colonel Gaddafi, did not hesitate to use force. Hundreds are said to have been killed. But many others deserted. The state is fragmenting. The east of the country is under the control of anti-Gaddafi rebels. Gaddafi himself made a bizarre television appearance to say he was ready to fight to the last bullet. It looked like a desperate last stand. His son, Saif al-Islam, said the rebels would plunge the country into civil war.
Forget oil, forget gas, forget these resources. Get ready for chaos.
The Arab world is diverse, and each Arab autocracy is autocratic in its own distinctive way. But there are unifying themes. In Egypt, President Mubarak used to argue that the only alternative to him was the anti-Western religious fundamentalism of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Bahrain, the royal family used to argue that the only alternative to them was bitter sectarian conflict between the country's Sunni and Shia communities. And in Libya, Saif al-Islam argued that without the unifying leadership of his father, the country would descend into civil war between its clans. But in taking to the streets in the name of civic citizens' democracies and social justice, the protesters have given the lie to each of these narratives and made us rethink deeply entrenched assumptions about the Arab world and about the kind of change that might now be possible there. The Arab world is in transition. We know what it is in transition from, but not yet what it's in transition to. But the relationship between Arab leaders and the people they rule over is fundamentally changed.
The Tunisians who demonstrated were inspired by the death of, the self-immolation of one man. They suddenly realized that he had the courage. Why shouldn't they have the courage? And then people in other countries, in other countries said, the Tunisians have done this. Why can't we have the courage? And that was Egypt. And then the Libyans felt, we don't have to put up with this any longer. The Yemenis are feeling that. The Syrians are probably feeling that. some Jordanians may be feeling that, or that's a different sort of country. The Iranians have already felt that in the 2009 Green Revolution.
Who would have thought that Mohammed Bouazizi's desperate self-immolation could effect so seismic a shift? In Sidi Bouzid, where the young fruit seller is buried, they have renamed the main street Boulevard Mohammed Bouazizi.
Alan Little. In a moment, we'll be speaking to the Israeli Kadima party leader Tzipi Livni, and from Amman to Ayman Safadi, who was until recently the Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan. First, let's join the BBC World Affairs editor John Simpson, who's in East Libya. John, is Muammar Gaddafi losing control of his country tonight?
Oh, I think it's reasonable to say that, certainly, yes, Gavin. I mean, I'm in Benghazi, in fact, where there's been a war going on for the first few days of the end of last week and the beginning of this week, which things like heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft guns used against the crowd. And yet, after 250 deaths or so, the interior minister has surrendered. He's here, and he's kind of still in position here. So, I mean, he's turned against Gaddafi. I think the country in general does seem to be turning against it, but there are pockets of support. So it isn't final yet. It's just it seems to me inconceivable that Gaddafi could reclaim control of this country now.
John, you've visited the region for many years. You've been in Egypt recently and so on. I mean, is your sense we really are at a historic turning point for the entire Arab world?
I would say that this is the 1989 of the Middle East, the year in which all the Eastern European satrapies of the Soviet Union changed their allegiance and turned away, and that's really what's happening here. That individual countries are deciding all the time. People in individual countries deciding all the time to move away from the old system to a new system. And once that reaches a kind of critical point in country after country, then as we saw, I think in 1989 and 1990, there's no turning back. So yes, I think this is people talk about seismic this and seismic that, but I think it's really serious. I do think this is 1989 for the Middle East.
John Simpson, thanks very much for joining us from Benghazi. Well, now let's go over to Amman and Ayman Safadi, who was the former Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Safadi, do you share that real sense of history that the old order is going or gone?
Many things have changed. It's sea change in a lot of ways now. I think the key question here, as your reporter said, transitioning from what to what. And I think that to what really depends on a number of factors. First of all, Arab countries, we cannot speak about them as if they're one unit. There are differences, and how the leadership in each and every country behaves. There are countries like Jordan, for instance, where you do not have the degree of political tension that you have elsewhere. You do not have political oppression. You have a leadership that is aware of the need to move forward, that has been urging reform for a while. It could be a good example of a country that can really take this process forward and really turn this moment of crisis into opportunity. How the regime deals with it is what can make it an opportunity in many different countries. Jordan could be an example where you have a popular regime, you have stability, and you have a king who's determined to move forward with reform. And he's already started major steps in that direction. So that could be a country that could transition into a better place. Others
indeed,
who do not.
But I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Safadi, but you could also say, you know, you've left it too late. 4 years, 4 decades, all across the Arab world, there have been the same complaints: nepotism, corruption, lack of opportunity, lack of jobs. And it's different in different countries, but it's also been true in Jordan too, isn't it?
Not to that extent. I beg to differ. Many in the Arab world has left it too late. In Jordan, we had a process of reform that has been going on for a while. Again, you have a high degree of political tolerance. You don't have one political prisoner in Jordan. You have the alarm bell against the lack of reform has been raised by the king 2-3 months ago. when he said we cannot afford to wait anymore, we have to move forward. So yes, and as the King himself said it, the story of reform has been 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. Now I think with all that's happening, those who've been standing against reform would have to think twice before they try to block the process again, because the answer to them is